When we first looked over the 6 tools that we were going to make reference to in this series on spiritual tools for polarizing times, we were putting them in order. We were figuring out how they should all fit together. And I was thinking, generous listening, that is so patronizing. The assumption that I am not already listening, that I need to be told to listen to people who are different than me. I read it and I thought, give me a break. That's all I do is listen. All we do is get information thrown at us all the time. You can hardly avoid it. I know all the things people are saying on the other side of this polarized divide. I know their arguments. I'm listening all the time. So then you know that's a good one for me to wrestle with. The one you read in the list that is most offensive to you is the one that you really need to sit with. That's why Penny got patience too. Penny got patience and I got generous listening. I realized, though, that my tendency in listening is to do a different kind of listening when it comes to polarization and people who think differently than me. I have a tendency to listen with an argument in mind. I have a tendency to listen looking for cracks or weak spots. I also, this is really getting confessional, I have a tendency to listen for a sort of the thrill of being very offended. There's something a little gratifying about hearing someone say something and thinking, oh, I can't believe it. Maybe I'm not the only one who feels that way occasionally. But I do have a tendency to read, there's a little bit of that kind of enjoyable shock. That's awful. Thank goodness I'm not like that. That, my friends, as it turns out, is not generous listening. There is, in a way, a kind of dehumanizing listening that I tend to do. I'm listening to the words. I'm not really listening to the person. I'm listening so that I can speak back. I'm listening so that I can say why it was wrong. I'm listening so that I can cut someone down. Now, in my mind, and I can sometimes convince myself that it's all in the service of a greater good, that if I could just win this argument, if I could just make sure and find all the weak spots in whatever someone else is saying, I'll be able to just cut it all the way down, and they won't say it again. But I kind of feel like we've tried that, and I kind of don't think it's working. I kind of feel like the best of the debate team has already kind of had their shot. And it doesn't seem like we're moving ahead together. Generous listening is something else. Generous listening, as it turns out, is more listening to who is speaking rather than to what they're saying. It's listening to who a person is with the idea that we might recognize each other, with the idea that we might have common ground, that we might have commonalities, that I might be able to understand with some sympathy how someone came to believe what they believe or how they came to say what they're saying. We can listen generously even to things that are painful to hear. We can listen generously even if someone is spewing all kinds of hate, even if they're spewing the coldest of logic with no compassion at all, even if what they're saying makes no sense. In a way, that's the easiest. Generous listening is something we can do in those settings. We have Zacchaeus this morning as a sort of viewpoint into what this might look like. And on the surface, and we've heard it preached many times, Zacchaeus, this short guy, and he gets in the tree, and he sees Jesus, and he's moved in some way, and Jesus comes over, and he says, "Oh, I've changed everything. Have all my stuff. This is great." But I think there's a lot of pieces in this passage that we don't always pick up on. Zacchaeus is a tax collector, right? So Zacchaeus has been going around to people who are, many of them, desperately poor and saying, "I need some of what you have." He's not only collecting on behalf of an occupying empire, he's also probably, if he's anything like other tax collectors, taking more than what he's told to take. He's making his own living, and he's, as we're told, he's a rich man. He's making a pretty good living off of the backs of people who cannot afford to pay even what they're being asked. This is not someone who probably has a lot of friends in this community. And so he shows up to see Jesus. We have in this passage to see who Jesus was. We actually don't know what he's doing there, and neither does Jesus, and I think that's important. We don't know whether he's there because his heart is strangely warmed and he feels drawn towards something, or whether he's there because he wants to figure out how to refute Jesus' arguments, or whether he's there because he's a spy and he's going to bring it back to the people he's collecting taxes for. We don't know. And neither does Jesus. He could be there for anything. And yet, Jesus sees him in that tree and recognizes something about him. We see Jesus recognize him as a person who is worthy of time. Now, why is Zacchaeus in the tree in the first place? We're told it's because he's short. But you can see the fact that he had to get in a tree tells you that the crowd was not interested in letting him see. The crowd that was there was not interested in him coming to the front, like you might if you were in community with someone who was shorter than you. You might say, "Here, stand in front of me so we can both see." That didn't happen for him. This congregation of folks, this community, did not have the time of day for him. They were not thinking of him as someone who belonged in the crowd. They were thinking of him as someone who belonged somewhere else, a figurehead, a stereotype, a caricature of a bad guy. He doesn't belong. He's not one of us. Get out of here. You've been by already. Get out of town. And so he ends up in the tree. And you can see in the passage that people were not best pleased that Jesus talked to him. It's uncomfortable when you feel pretty confident that you're on the right side of things and that someone else is a bad guy. It's much more comfortable to talk to other people who feel the same way that you do about that. And it's very uncomfortable to see someone that you love and admire acting differently. It's very uncomfortable. The crowd, you can see, they're very uncomfortable. But somehow, Jesus recognizes him. And you see what happens. That Zacchaeus feels known, feels seen as a person, as someone with worth, as someone maybe even with potential, as someone who's worth spending time with. And that's all it takes. That's all it takes for him in this passage to say, I'm going to change. I'm going to do differently. I see a path forward back into community. One person. Now, it was Jesus, so that's at least a little bit of a ringer. I'm not necessarily saying that any of us is going to be able to do exactly this. But here is at least one picture of at least one bad guy who, being seen and known, is able to change. And for me, as you heard a couple of weeks ago, this is what this whole series is for. It's not just so that we can have a pleasant chat with someone we disagree with. It's so we can move forward together in community in some way. It's so we can change each other's minds, so we can make decisions together. These tools are not just to make things a little nicer. They're to make things more possible. Generous listening comes at the end of the series because it requires all the other tools to be able to do it. It requires humility where we started, a little bit less of a grasp on knowing how things are going to play out. It requires adventurous civility, courage to show up and to see, because generous listening is vulnerable. It's vulnerable because in order to listen generously, we have to actually open our hearts up a little bit. And every time we do that, there's the possibility of getting hurt. Adventurous civility, not just regular civility, is required. It takes patience because it's not going to work every time. Because things that start happening for people might unfold over weeks or months or years, and we don't know. It takes hospitality, thinking of what it would look like to make space in that crowd for Zacchaeus to be part of the community. And it takes thinking carefully about the words that we use. Thinking carefully about how we're going to speak to each other. Finding new language that's not going to make people feel defensive or ashamed. Generous listening speaks to a lot of what Brené Brown works on this, how to talk to each other and listen to each other in ways that don't make us feel ashamed or defensive. Because we are all small and scared in some ways. We are all afraid that there will be no place at the table for us, that the community will close off, that we will not have access to what we need physically and relationally, that we'll lose our connections to other people. And so when we're being asked to change, it's really easy for us to start feeling ashamed, for us to start feeling afraid. Generous listening, recognizing the person who speaks as a human, as worthy, as full of potential, while vulnerable, is, I think, the only way to return to relationship with each other without triggering that kind of shame and fear in each other. It is really hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's really hard and it's really vulnerable, and we're going to try sometimes and we're going to disappoint each other. We're going to open ourselves to people who are going to disappoint us. But on the other hand, there's no other way to get where we're trying to go. Because we are not just in this for politeness, we are in this to become a community together, to begin to recognize what we have in common, to recognize what we owe each other. Because at the end of the day, all of the lines that we draw to separate one group from another are in our minds. The ways that we belong to each other are so much more profound than the ways that we separate from one another. All of the categories that we create to sort ourselves are so small compared to what we have together. And generous listening is what makes space for us to see that at the end of the day, we are all kin. We are all part of one thing. And while it might be satisfying in some ways to gather up with folks we agree with and just lob grenades over into the other camp, the way of the world and the way of the universe means that all the things that we throw come right back and land in our own communities. All of the things that we direct outward land back with us, because at the end of the day, we belong to each other. As I was thinking about that kind of belonging, that kind of risky belonging this week, I realized that I have in fact had an experience of that kind of unconditional belonging, and it was in church. Because I had a church that agreed to baptize me when I was an infant before I even did anything. The church said to me, "You are one of us. You belong here. No matter what you do in the future, no matter what you say, no matter where you go, you can't undo this belonging. We belong to you and you belong to us, no matter what kind of things you get up to." Sometimes we might wish that wasn't true, but that kind of belonging that says you cannot undo, that's real in my life, and I recognize it. That's the kind of belonging we have with each other. There's nothing we can do about it, as much as we might feel polarized. I don't know how this is all going to shape up. I don't know whether we're really going to work this out in a clear way in my lifetime. I don't know how the election is going to go, whether we're going to figure out new ways to talk to each other. But I know what it looks like if we don't try. I think we all do. And I know what it looks like when we all start experiencing that kind of belonging, because we have it in Scripture. The lion lays down with the lamb, and milk and honey are flowing, and everyone has what they need, and everyone has a place to belong and thrive, and the earth is well, and everyone feels full of love. We know what it looks like when we are not there. But we have this image, all these images of what it looks like when we are. And I believe in that as much as I believe in what we're living now. The work is worth it. Even if we don't get exactly there in any of our lifetimes, the work is worth it, both for what it does to the world and for what it does in our own hearts. May these tools that we have been given, that we have engaged with, serve us. And may we all have the courage and the creativity to begin right now to put them to work. Amen.